In a world where the only civilization is the wilderness, and the wind and frost dictate the law, every sunrise is not a guaranteed event, but a gift. This is the story of a man who decided to challenge the wild nature of Alaska. The story of Heimo Korth, the last pioneer whose life was a series of harsh trials. His world is not just nature, but a deadly enemy that does not forgive mistakes. In spring, there will be no trace of him left if he is not ready. This is a world where knowledge is not just power, but the only hope. What forgotten survival techniques, long lost to the modern world, could save his life? Watch the video to the end to find out how ancient knowledge helped him survive. In a world where glue did not exist and any breakdown could be fatal, the ability to repair things was one of the most important skills. Heimo Korth knew how to extract and process resin from coniferous trees, turning it into a universal glue. It was a complex, multi-step process that required patience and an understanding of the properties of natural materials. First, he collected raw resin, then heated it until it became liquid to remove all impurities. He added charcoal powder or fat to the purified resin to give it plasticity and strength. He used this glue to repair broken handles, seal seams on clothing, and repair shoes. It was his own ancient super glue that saved his life. The technology of obtaining glue from resin was vital. It allowed Heimo not only to repair broken items, but also to create new ones. For example, he could glue arrowheads to shafts or knife blades to handles. It was a kind of personal production that allowed him to create the tools necessary for survival. Resin was a versatile material. Heimo used it not only to make glue, but also for sealing. For example, he could apply resin to the seams of his clothes to keep them waterproof. This was very important in Alaska, where clothes were constantly getting wet. Resin was also used to seal the boats he made from birch bark. This was his own ancient form of boat building, which allowed him to travel along the rivers. Working with resin was a kind of art. It required patience, skill, and knowledge of the properties of natural materials. Heimo could create glue that was strong and durable. It was a kind of science that helped him survive in harsh conditions. In the end, resin glue was not just glue, but a symbol of ingenuity and survival skills. It allowed Heimo to repair the world around him and create new things that were necessary for his life. What modern material did Heimo lack? Write your opinion in the comments. In the harsh conditions of Alaska, where the rivers froze and heating a bath was too expensive, maintaining hygiene was not just a matter of comfort, but of survival. Heimo used a method that could be called a cold bath. He rubbed his body with ashes left over from the fire. The ashes, which contained alkaline elements, acted as an absorbent, soaking up dirt and grease. It was a kind of primitive soap. This method allowed him to keep his body clean. He then cleaned his skin with dry moss or grass. It was a simple but effective way to avoid disease and infection. Maintaining hygiene was vital for survival. In conditions where there were no antibiotics, any infection could be fatal. Heimo knew that dirt was a source of disease, so he tried to keep his body clean. He used natural remedies that were available to him. For example, ash from a campfire was a versatile remedy. It not only cleansed the skin, but also helped with skin diseases because it had antiseptic properties. Hygiene was not just a routine, but an important part of his life. It helped Heimo feel better and be confident. It was a kind of ritual that he repeated every day. And although he did not have modern hygiene products, he found ways to keep his body clean. This shows that Heimo was not only intelligent, but also caring towards his body. In addition to ash, he also used other natural remedies. For example, he could use leaves and herbs that had antiseptic properties. He could rub them on his skin to clean it and protect it from insects. This was a kind of ancient deodorant and repellent that helped him survive. How did he maintain cleanliness in the permafrost when soap was a luxury? We will tell you soon. An igloo is not just a house made of ice, but an ingenious engineering structure based on the principles of thermodynamics and light control. The Inuit learned this skill from the indigenous peoples. They built igloos from dense blocks of snow that they cut with a knife. Snow, thanks to its structure, was an excellent insulator. It trapped the heat created inside and kept the cold outside. Inside the igloo, it was much warmer than outside, even in the most severe frosts. But how did he deal with the darkness? He used transparent blocks of ice, which he inserted into the walls to let light in. It was a kind of primitive double glazing that allowed him to see without letting the heat escape. Building the igloo was quick and efficient. In a few hours, Heimo could erect a sturdy and warm shelter that could withstand even strong winds. The key element was the spiral technique of stacking the blocks, which ensured the strength and stability of the structure. Each block was laid at a slight angle to create a dome. This was his own architectural art, which required precision and skill. Inside the igloo was a microclimate. The temperature inside could be 20–30 degrees higher than outside. This was achieved by the heat given off by his body, the fire, and the animals. Snow, thanks to its porous structure, did not allow heat to escape. At the same time, it left a small opening at the top to allow carbon dioxide to escape, and at the bottom to allow fresh air to enter. It was a kind of ancient ventilation system. Using ice for lighting was a brilliant solution. Ice allowed light to pass through well, but not heat. This allowed him to illuminate the interior without losing precious heat. Ice was his window to the world, which he could see without leaving his shelter. It was his own architectural genius that allowed him to live in harmony with nature. In the end, the igloo was not just a shelter, but a masterpiece of engineering. It was created with love and attention to detail. A dislocation or fracture in Alaska is not just painful, it is life-threatening. Without doctors or medicine, Heimo relied on his knowledge. To treat dislocations, he used immobilization with splints made of branches and tendons. This helped to fix the limb in the correct position. He then used cold compresses made of snow or ice to reduce swelling and pain. He also used resin from coniferous trees. It not only had antiseptic properties, but also helped with bruises and sprains. By mixing the resin with fat, he made an ointment that he applied to the affected area. This ointment reduced inflammation and helped with pain. Folk medicine was a vital science that Heimo mastered perfectly. He knew which herbs and plants could be used for treatment. For example, he used willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, a kind of natural aspirin. Its decoction helped him with headaches and fever. He also used sphagnum moss, which had excellent antiseptic properties. He used it as a bandage on wounds to prevent infection. Knowledge of anatomy was also an important skill. Heimo knew how to properly set dislocations and how to fix broken bones. This was a form of ancient surgery that saved his life. He also knew how to make primitive stitches using animal tendons and bone needles. This helped him sew up deep cuts and wounds. Medicine was not just a set of knowledge, but a kind of survival art. It required patience, skill, and knowledge of the properties of natural materials. Heimo was his own doctor, working without tools or medicine. He relied on his knowledge and skills to survive in harsh conditions. Think about it. Could you survive with just a tar plaster if you were bitten by a bear? Okay, let's not go there. Let's find out how our hero not only defended himself, but also hunted those very bears. Hunting large game was not always possible, so Heimo relied on hunting small game. He used homemade traps and snares made of wood, rope, and stones. These traps were very effective. He set them on the trails used by animals. He also used a bow and arrows. This was a silent weapon that allowed him to hunt animals without scaring them away. It was his own art, which required patience and skill. The skill of trap making was a vital skill. Heimo knew how to make a trap that was not only effective, but also safe. He used different types of traps: snare traps for small animals, crush traps for rabbits and squirrels. Each trap was made with the animal's behavior in mind. For example, the beaver trap was designed with the knowledge that beavers always return to their habitat. It was his own ancient engineering that allowed him to survive. Hunting small game was not only a way to obtain food, but also a way to survive. Small game was more accessible and less dangerous. It was a kind of constant source of food. Heimo could also use small game to make clothing and tools. For example, squirrel and rabbit skins were used to make warm clothing and shoes. Bones were used to make tools. Bows and arrows were more effective weapons than guns. They were silent and left no traces. This was important in conditions where it was necessary to remain unnoticed. Bows and arrows were also more economical weapons, as they did not require ammunition. They could be used to hunt any game. In the end, hunting small game wasn't just a way to get food, but a way to survive. It let Heim survive in harsh conditions and not waste valuable resources. It was his own art, which needed patience, skill, and knowledge. In a world without communication, signal fires were the only way to communicate. Heimo used them to send messages. For example, one fire could mean that everything was fine, and two could mean that help was needed. These signals were his own ancient Morse code. In addition, he used the stars as his main navigational tool. He knew where the North Star was and how to find the constellations. This knowledge allowed him to move around at night and not get lost. Signal fires had their own grammar. Their location, size, and amount of smoke could convey different messages. For example, a large column of smoke could mean that Heimo had found food or shelter, while intermittent smoke could mean that he was lost. These signals were understood by everyone who lived in these lands. It was a kind of language that spoke of life and death. The ability to read the stars was a vital skill. Heimo knew that the stars did not just shine, but moved along certain paths. He could use this knowledge to determine the time of day and the season. This was important for planning hunts and gathering. For example, he knew when birds arrived or when certain plants appeared. Navigation was not just a science, but an art. It required patience, skill, and knowledge. Heimo learned from his ancestors how to find his way in the forest and mountains. He used natural landmarks such as mountains, rivers, and lakes. He memorized their shapes and locations so he wouldn't get lost. In the end, signal fires and navigation were vital skills. They allowed Heimo to survive in harsh conditions and communicate with others. It was a kind of connection that united him with the world. What would be scarier, going out alone into the wilderness without a compass, or staying in camp and waiting for help that might never come? And if danger and hunger lurk at every turn, where would you find medicine or food? Stay tuned. We'll tell you soon. Knowledge of plants and herbs was a vital skill. Heimo used them to treat illnesses, prepare food, and make tools. For example, he used birch bark to make dishes and willow to make ropes. He also used moss and lichen for cooking. They were rich in nutrients and helped him survive when there was no food. It was his own pharmacy and restaurant. Botanical knowledge was vital for survival. Heimo knew which plants were edible and which were poisonous. He could find food even in the harshest conditions. For example, he knew that young pine shoots were rich in vitamin C and could help with scurvy, which was a common disease among pioneers. He also used burdock roots for cooking, as they were rich in starch and could replace potatoes. Herbs were not only food but also medicine. Heimo used them to treat illnesses and injuries. For example, he used aspen bark, which contained salicin, to treat fever and pain. He also used herbs with antiseptic properties to treat wounds. This was his own ancient pharmacy, which helped him survive without medicine. Plants were also materials for making tools. For example, he used ash wood, which was strong and flexible, to make bows and arrows. He also used willow branches to make baskets and ropes. This was his own ancient production, which allowed him to create things necessary for survival. All of this suggests that Heimo was not just a hunter and gatherer, but an intelligent and knowledgeable man. He used his knowledge of nature to survive in harsh conditions. His botanical knowledge was vital to his survival. Loneliness was one of Heimo's main enemies. He could go months without seeing other people. In these conditions, it is very easy to break down. He used several techniques to cope with this. First, he worked constantly. Work kept him from thinking about the bad things. Second, he talked to himself. This helped him feel less lonely. Third, he created rituals. For example, he would drink tea at the same time every day. These rituals created a sense of order and control over the situation. Psychological resilience was as important a skill as the ability to obtain food. It's one thing to fight nature, but it's quite another to fight yourself. Heimo knew that his mind was his greatest ally or his worst enemy. To avoid despair, he created a familiar and predictable world around himself. Daily routines, such as sharpening his knife or checking traps, became a form of meditation. These simple actions helped him maintain a sense of purpose and stay connected to reality. He also used creativity as a way to cope with loneliness. Heimo could carve figures out of wood, draw on bark, or make simple musical instruments. These activities helped him express emotions and feelings that he couldn't put into words. Creativity was a form of psychotherapy that helped him cope with stress and pressure. It was a way of expressing himself that helped him feel better and more confident. In the end, psychological resilience was not just a character trait, but a vital skill. It helped Heimo survive in the harshest conditions. He was not only strong, but also smart, and his mind was his main weapon. He knew that only a strong spirit could overcome loneliness and despair. Heimo's equipment was his second home. Every item had its own role and meaning. The knife was the main tool used for everything from cutting game to making tools. The axe was necessary for gathering firewood and building. The rifle was a means of defense and hunting. Clothing was layered, consisting of skins and wool. It was warm and waterproof. Shoes were made of leather and fur. They were warm and durable. The backpack was made of leather and wood. It was sturdy and spacious. Every piece of equipment was carefully designed. A knife, for example, was not just a tool, but an extension of the hand. It had to be sharp, durable, and comfortable to use. Knives were made of high-quality steel, and the handles were made of wood or bone. Each knife was unique and reflected Heimo's individuality. The axe was no less important. It was used for gathering firewood, building shelters, and even for defense. The axe was a kind of universal tool that helped Heimo survive in the wild. Clothing was layered to protect against the cold and wind. The bottom layer consisted of wool, which retained heat, and the top layer consisted of skins, which protected against wind and moisture. Clothing was a kind of living organism that helped Heimo adapt to changing conditions. It was a kind of armor that protected him from the cold and danger. The shoes were made of leather and fur to protect against the cold and moisture. They were warm, durable, and waterproof. The shoes were a kind of extension of the feet, allowing Heimo to move around on snow and ice. They were a kind of engineering marvel that allowed him to survive in the harshest conditions. The backpack was made of leather and wood to be durable and spacious. It was a kind of home on his back that allowed Heimo to carry everything he needed with him. The backpack was a symbol of freedom and independence that allowed him to move through the wilderness. Winter food was different. Heimo relied on dried meat that he prepared in the summer. He also gathered mushrooms and berries which he dried. This was his own form of preservation. He also ate honey that he found in tree hollows. This was his own vitamin complex which helped him survive the winter. Preparing for winter was a key element of survival. In summer and fall, Heimo worked tirelessly to gather and preserve as much food as possible. Dried meat was the main source of protein. He cut the meat into thin strips, salted it, and dried it in the sun or over a fire. The result was a product that could be stored for months without spoiling. It was a kind of ancient protein bar that gave him the energy he needed to survive. Gathering and drying berries and mushrooms were equally important. Berries such as lingonberries and cranberries were rich in vitamins, and mushrooms were rich in nutrients. They were dried in the sun or on special racks over a fire. Dried berries and mushrooms were light and easy to carry. They were a kind of vitamin complex that helped him avoid scurvy and other diseases. Honey was not only a delicacy, but also an important source of energy. It was rich in carbohydrates and sugar, which gave him strength. Heimo found honey in tree hollows and stored it in special containers. Honey was also used as a medicine because it had antiseptic properties. In the end, winter food wasn't just a bunch of stuff to eat, but a survival strategy. Heimo knew how to gather, store, and use natural resources. His knowledge of nutrition was super important for him to stay alive. He was his own nutritionist, working without books or labs. We have seen how Heimo Korth survived in the harsh conditions of Alaska. His life was full of difficulties, but he was able to survive thanks to his knowledge, skills, and strength of spirit. He was a true hero who conquered this harsh land. He showed us that a person can survive in the most extreme conditions if they have knowledge and the will to live. The story of Heimo Korth is a story about the strength of the human spirit and its ability to survive. Little is known about his fate. Some historians believe that he died alone in his hut, while others believe that he returned to civilization but never spoke about his life in Alaska. His story remains a mystery, but the skills and abilities he used to survive remain with us. They are proof that a person can survive in the harshest conditions if they have knowledge and the will to live. What would you like to see next? A story about how the pioneers fought hunger or how they built their homes? If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. See you next time.